Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God. Back with you with the next video in this series reading Oliver Twist as read by Lord Naren White. Without further ado, returning to Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. And he shall have it too, rejoined the man, administering another blow, and seizing Oliver by the collar. Come on, you young villain! Here, Bullseye. Mind him, boy, mind him. Weak with recent illness, stupefied by the blows and the suddenness of the attack, terrified by the fierce growling of the dog and the brutality of the man, overpowered by the conviction of the bystanders that he really was the hardened little wretch he was described to be. What could one poor child do? Darkness had set in. It was a lone neighborhood. No help was near. Resistance was useless. In another moment, he was dragged into a labyrinth of dark, narrow courts, and was forced along them at a pace which rendered the few cries he dared to give utterance to unintelligible. It was of little moment, indeed, whether they were intelligible or no, for there was nobody to care for them, had they been ever so plain. The gas lamps were lighted. Mrs. Bedwin was waiting anxiously at the open door. The servant had run up the street 20 times to see if there were any traces of Oliver, and still the two old gentlemen sat, preservingly in the dark parlor, with the watch between them. Chapter 16 relates what became of Oliver Twist after he had been claimed by Nancy. The narrow streets and courts, at length, terminated in a large open space scattered about, which were pens for beasts, and other indications of a cattle market. Sikes slackened his pace when they reached this spot, the girl being quite unable to support any longer the rapid rate at which they had hitherto walked. Turning to Oliver, he roughly commanded him to take hold of Nancy's hand. "Do you hear?" growled Sikes, as Oliver hesitated and looked round. They were in a dark corner, quite out of the track of passengers. Oliver saw, but too plainly, that resistance would be of no avail. He held out his hand, which Nancy clasped tight in hers. "Give me the other," said Sikes, putting his other hand to Oliver's throat. If he speaks ever so soft a word, hold him. Do you mind?" The dog growled again, and licking his lips, eyed Oliver as if he were anxious to attach himself to his windpipe without delay. "He's as willing as a Christian. Strike me blind if he isn't," said Sikes, regarding the animal with a kind of grim and ferocious approval. "Now you know what you've got to expect, master, so call away as quick as you like. The dog will soon stop that game. Get on, young'un." Bullseye wagged his tail in acknowledgment of this unusually endearing form of speech, and giving vent to another admonitory growl for the benefit of Oliver, led the way onward. It was Smithfield that they were crossing, although it might have been Grosvenor Square, for anything Oliver knew to the contrary. The night was dark and foggy. The lights in the shops could scarcely struggle through the heavy mist, which thickened every moment and shrouded the streets and houses in gloom, rendering the strange place still stranger in Oliver's eyes and making his uncertainty the more dismal and depressing. They had hurried on a few paces when a deep church bell struck the hour. With its first stroke, his two conductors stopped and turned their heads in the direction whence the sound proceeded. "8 o'clock, Bill," said Nancy, when the bell ceased. "What's the good of telling me that? I can't hear it, can't I?" replied Sikes. I wonder whether they can hear it, said Nancy. Of course they can, replied Sikes. It was Bartlemy time when I shopped, and there warn't a penny trumpet in the fair, as I couldn't hear the squeaking on. Arter I was locked up for the night, the rowing din outside made the thundering old jail so silent that I could almost have beat my brains out against the iron plates of the door. Poor fellow, said Nancy, who still had her face towards the quarter in which the bell had sounded. Oh, Bill, such fine young chaps as them. Yes, that's all you women think of, answered Sikes. Fine young chaps. Well, they're as good as dead, so it don't much matter. With this consolation, Mr. Sikes appeared to repress a rising tendency to jealousy, and clasping Oliver's wrist more firmly, told him to step out again. Wait a minute, said the girl. I wouldn't hurry by if it was you that was coming out to be hung. The next time 8 o'clock struck, Bill, I'd walk round the place till I dropped, if the snow was on the ground, and hadn't a shawl to cover me. And what good would that do? Inquired the unsentimental Mr. Sikes. Unless you could pitch over a file and 20 yards of good stout rope, you might as well be walking 50 mile off, or not walking at all, for all the good it would do me. Come on, and don't stand preaching there. The girl burst into a laugh, drew her shawl more closely round her, and they walked away. But Oliver felt her hand tremble, and looking up in her face as they passed a gas lamp, saw that it had turned a deadly white. They walked on, by little frequented and dirty ways, for a full half hour, meeting very few people, and those appearing from their looks to hold much the same position in society as Mr. Sikes himself. At length they turned into a very filthy, narrow street, nearly full of old clothes shops, the dog running forward, as if conscious that there was no further occasion for his keeping on guard, stopped before the door of a shop that was closed and apparently untenanted. The house was in a ruinous condition, and on the door was nailed a board, intimating that it was to let, which looked as if it had hung there for many years. All right, cried Sikes, glancing curiously about. Nancy stooped below the shutters, and Oliver heard the sound of a bell. They crossed to the opposite side of the street, and stood for a few moments under a lamp. A noise, as if a sash window were gently raised, was heard, and soon afterwards the door softly opened. Mr. Sikes then seized the terrified boy by the collar with a very little ceremony, and all three were quickly inside the house. The passage was perfectly dark. They waited, while the person who had let them in chained and barred the door. Anybody here? Inquired Sikes. No, replied a voice, which Oliver thought he had heard before. Is the old un here? Asked the robber. Yes, replied the voice. And precious down in the mouth he has been. Won't he be glad to see you? Oh, no. The style of this reply, as well as the voice which delivered it, seemed familiar to Oliver's ears. But it was impossible to distinguish even the form of the speaker in the darkness. Let's have a glim, said Sikes, or we shall go breaking our necks, or treading on the dog. Look after your legs if you do. And we'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.